Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, the novel, Chapter 1, Searching for the Truth. Yvette Cale looked out of the car as her husband pulled into the driveway of the Roivas estate. She would have thought the place very lovely, if not for the creatures that were all around the place. She never really understood why her husband never saw them. There had to be a good reason why she could see them. Did they stand on the brink of reality, waiting to cross? If that was the case, how could she see them? She always saw odd things, even when her father would take her on archaeological digs. Soon she heard the car stop, as her husband said, "Here we are, hon, the home of Dr. Edward Roivas. I do hope he's home right now." Yvette looked at the house, noticing the odd hole in the wall on the second floor. "I hope he's safe. That missing window doesn't bode well." She then pointed up at the second floor, where there was a hole in the wall. She watched as her husband followed her gaze, and when he looked up where she looked, she knew he didn't see it. She then got the answer she suspected would come. "Dear, there is a window up there. I must admit it does look out of place. It's a giant stained glass window." Now she understood something about the window. She looked further up and noticed a piece of paper floating in midair. She couldn't tell what the paper was, but there had to be a reason it was floating in an invisible window. The window was a hiding place. She looked at her husband and said, Richard, there is something floating in that window. The stained glass window, you see, must be hiding something. I also think that those things out there are what it's being hidden from." She watched as some of the creatures started to advance. They weren't moving fast, but she knew they had planned to strike. As they advanced, she ran over to the door to the building. She turned to see Richard coming towards her, with a worried look on his face. "Yvette, what has gotten into you? Why are you acting so scared?" She looked at him and said, "I'll explain later. Right now, we need to get inside. Something is approaching us, and I don't think it means us any good intentions." She saw him nod, and then watched as he knocked on the door. She hoped it would open soon. She then took a glance back, only to see that some of the creatures had gotten closer since she last looked. She hoped that none of them would attack before they got in the door. She also hoped that Dr. Edward Roivas was not so old that he lost his speed. Alexandra Roivas looked around the main hall. When the police said she could enter the building again, they had given her one key. She thought it was to the front door, but she was shocked to discover that the front door was unlocked. The police wouldn't have been so careless. Not only had the estate been the scene of a murder, but the place was also old and her family was rich. The mansion was a burglar's dream job. However, when she thought about it, there was never a burglary in the estate's long history. In fact, the only things she did remember about the mansion's history was the fact that all the ills had been caused by her family. However, Now was the time to find something out about what happened to her grandfather. She was about to head up the steps when she heard someone knocking on the door. She looked over at the door and wondered if it was her imagination. Soon the knocking came again, and she ran to the door. When she opened it, she saw a young couple, although both appeared to be older than her. She looked at them and said, "Can I help you?" She was almost surprised when the young woman entered and said, "First of all, I'd feel better inside." She watched as the man followed, apparently surprised by the woman's aggressiveness. The woman then said, "It's safer in here right now." She closed the door, still in shock, but heard the man say, "Yvette, don't be rude." She watched as the man then faced her and said, "I'm sorry. My name is Richard Cale. This is my wife, Yvette. Is Dr. Roivas in?" She started to realize a few things about these people. The first was that they didn't know about her grandfather's death. She wondered also if they knew him. She tried to hold back the grief the news had caused and said, "I'm sorry, but my grandfather died 2 weeks ago. I'm Alexandra Roivas." Alexandra looked at the couple and saw they were in shock. She then saw Yvette walk to a window and look out, saying, "Those things got him, hon. All those things out there got him. I don't think they got what they were looking for, but they got him. That's why they are watching this place." Alexandra turned to Richard and said, "What is she talking about, and how do you know my grandfather?" She watched as Richard pulled out a book and opened it. "This is how. This book had a message from him to us. I had called 2 weeks ago. In fact, I think the time it ended in England was 11 a.m. What time did you receive the call that he died?" Alex was now growing suspicious, but not by these people, but by other things. She had no doubt about the book because she recognized her grandfather's writing. She looked at Richard and said, 3:33 a.m. on the West Coast. I have a feeling you two are telling the truth, but what it does leave us with is who killed my grandfather and why." She also wondered one other thing. She then said, "By the way, why are you arriving here now?" Richard respected the question. He looked at Alexandra and said, "Alexandra, if I may call you that, when I spoke to your grandfather 2 weeks ago, he said to arrive here in 2 weeks. He might have known this was coming and wanted us here to help you." He then looked around the room. He hoped there would be some clue to what had happened. It was then he noticed the clock on the table. "Alexandra, what time did you get the call?" As he walked over to the clock, he heard her say, 3:33 a.m. Why did you have to ask that again? He then saw that she was looking at the clock face, and as she gasped, "It stopped at that time. That is odd. To be honest, I never noticed it working. I don't think it ever was round." He was startled when Yvette said, "You can't wind that clock with that key. That key isn't for a clock." He then looked at the key to the clock and saw his wife was right. He held it up and heard Yvette say, "That looks like the key to one of the dressers back home. Maybe there is a drawer upstairs that needs to be opened." It was at that moment he saw Alexandra run up the steps. He followed her with Yvette at his side. Maybe they could get some answers, or at least some more clues. However, by the time they were up there, he heard Alexandra shout, "Damn it! The key broke. There is no way we can get to the other rooms now." Richard saw her drop the broken key, but he quickly grabbed the pieces. He looked at her and then said, "Let's check the other rooms. Maybe there's a spare key elsewhere. What rooms can we check?" He watched Alexandra head down the steps and followed as she said, "Well, there is the kitchen, the music room, and the library. Let's check the kitchen first. I know my family had servants working here. There might be a spare in there." He nodded and followed her in. As they all entered, he heard Yvette say, "I think we have a clue right here. Take a look at this door." He looked right where she was looking, and he felt his eyes grow wide. On the door was a metal plate, and a glowing purple rune was on it. He then heard Alexandra say, "What is that? And what is that sword on the plate?" He thought about it and finally said, "It looks like the rune of Mantarok. He's one of the ancients mentioned in your grandfather's book. As for the sword, I don't know what to make of it, but I have a feeling that anything we need is behind that door." He then heard a door close, and he turned around to see his wife had left the room. He ran out the door only to see her enter a back room. "Where is she going?" He heard Alexandra answer him, "That's the music room. My grandfather has a nice grand piano in there, as well as a fireplace and a very odd painting." That raised his interest, as he ran in after his wife. When he entered, he saw his wife looking at the picture, and he heard Alexandra say, "That's the painting I mentioned. It looks like that symbol in the center is the one on the plaque." He glanced at it, and his wife said the one thing he was thinking. "Red conquers green, green conquers blue, blue conquers red. It's an eternal circle, just like in the book, right?" Richard nodded and said, "Yes, my love, it is. However, this is a clue. Something seems odd about the fireplace." He knocked on the back wall and realized what he heard. "There's a room behind here. Now all we have to do is find a way in. I have a feeling there is only one place to find the entrance." He looked at his wife and then at Alexandra, and he could tell she knew where they would find the entrance. Alexandra knew what Richard was hinting at. The only two doors that were locked were to the upstairs hall and to the basement. That meant the only other room to go was the library, the place her grandfather died. She looked at her two guests and said, "I think you should know that my grandfather died in the library. The police might have cleaned up the mess. It has been 2 weeks, but I should brace you for the worst." She watched both nod and then led them out of the music room and to the library. As soon as they entered, she heard Yvette gasp and say, "My goodness, this room is disturbed. There is something in here, I can tell." As she led them back to the part where her grandfather was found, she heard Richard say, "She's right. Something is hidden in here. For some reason, it feels like there is more here than even we suspect. All we have to do is find it." Soon, they were in the back of the library, where her grandfather's desk was. This was where he did most of his work. It was then she saw the grandfather clock. Even that had stopped. Then she looked at it a second time. She smiled and said, "I think I found the entrance." She walked over to the clock and started to move the hands. Soon the time reached 3:33, and she heard it. She turned to see Richard and Yvette looking at a bookshelf sliding out of the way. It was a hidden hallway. She watched as Richard started heading in and said, "This is it. This is where we will hopefully find our answers." She and Yvette followed Richard into the hall and waited as he stopped at the door. He then said, "I think you should enter first, Alexandra." She nodded and opened the door. She was surprised at what the room held. It was a secret room. As she entered, she saw things from all over the world. Her grandfather had been busy. In fact, her family had to have been busy. She then watched as Yvette walked in and looked at the desk. She saw her gazing at a book, only to hear her say, "That's it. That has all our answers." Alexandra sat down at the desk and opened the book. Soon, images flooded her mind. She saw horrible things in dark images. She shook her head and looked up again. She noticed that Yvette looked scared. She went to ask Richard why, but realized the reason. Richard Cale had disappeared. She looked down at the book again and was surprised to see a ghostly image of him on the first page. It was faint, almost unnoticeable, but she wondered if this dark book had claimed him. She looked back at the book and read the title of the chapter, "The Chosen One." As she began the chapter, she looked at Yvette and said, "Don't worry, Yvette. Once I read this chapter, he should be back."